Hey, we're focusing on something that probably rings a bell if you're into technical writing or documentation. AsciiDoc.
Right. You sent over some YouTube transcripts discussing it, comparing it to Markdown.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. So our mission really is to get clear on what AsciiDoc is.
What it's good for. Its strengths. How it stacks up against Markdown, and maybe why you might want to consider it.
Especially for that tech docs and publishing side of things.
Definitely.
Because look, everyone knows Markdown. It's simple. It's everywhere.
Super approachable.
But these sources really suggested AsciiDoc offers something, well, more standardized, more feature-packed, maybe surprisingly so.
Yeah, it might change how you think about markup if you've only ever used Markdown.
Okay, so let's dive in. AsciiDoc versus Markdown. Initial thoughts.
Well, the first thing the sources pointed out is that if you know Markdown basics,
Like headings with the hashes,
yeah, or paragraphs just being text blocks, code with backticks, lists,
asterisks, numbers.
right? If you know that stuff, AsciiDoc won't feel completely alien at first. There's some overlap.
But the syntax does diverge pretty quickly, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. One key thing is indentation. In lots of Markdown flavors, how you indent can change the meaning.
Like for code blocks or nested lists?
Exactly. AsciiDoc, though,
Yeah.
it doesn't really rely on that in the same way for structure.
So what does it use instead?
It uses specific characters more deliberately, and these plus signs sometimes, to kind of group blocks together.
Okay.
One source made an analogy to Perl, where every little symbol seems to matter.
Suggests is maybe a bit more precise or maybe denser?
Could be richer syntax, perhaps, but it points to a potential benefit too. The single specification. Markdown has all these different flavors, right? Common Mark, GFM.
Oh yeah, that can be annoying. Things look different depending on where you view it.
Exactly. AsciiDoc aims for one standard. So your document should, in theory, render much more consistently across different tools.
That sounds like a huge plus for like serious documentation projects.
Absolutely. Consistency is king there.
Okay, what about just like basic formatting? Bold, italics?
Pretty similar, thankfully. Asterisks for bold and both.
And underscores for italics.
Underscores for italics, yeah. Same deal. But AsciiDoc quickly adds more options right out of the box.
Like what?
The sources mentioned built-in ways to do highlighting.
Oh, nice. How?
Often double plus signs, I think. And underlining, maybe double underscores. And strike through too.
So more built-in styling without needing HTML or CSS right away.
Kind of, yeah. A slightly bigger basic toolkit.
And then there's this idea of block elements you mentioned.
Right. This seems pretty central to how AsciiDoc thinks about structure.
So a block is like a paragraph or a code section or a list.
Yeah, any distinct chunk of content. AsciiDoc sees them as structured units. And there's a consistent pattern for defining them.
What's that?
Often uses square brackets to specify the type of block.
Ah, okay. So you might see source for a code block or note for an admonition.
Exactly that kind of thing. That consistency is supposed to make it easier to read and for
And structure. Let's get into the really powerful stuff.
yeah, the features that really set it apart.
The include function kept popping up in the materials you sent. That sounds potentially game-changing.
It really does. Imagine having standard intro paragraphs or maybe legal disclaimers.
Yeah, that you need in multiple documents. Keeping them updated is a pain.
Right. So AsciiDoc lets you just include one file inside another.
Okay, like just pasting the text in.
It's smarter than that. You can tell it to offset the heading levels.
Oh, so a level 1 heading in the included file can automatically become, say, a level 3 heading when it's pulled into the main doc.
Precisely. So you can write content once and reuse it seamlessly in different contexts, standalone, or as part of a bigger manual.
That's huge. For maintenance and consistency, that's really powerful.
Definitely a big one for documentation teams.
Okay, another term that came up was attributes. What are those about?
Think of them like variables for your document.
Variables, how so?
You can define a value, like say your product name, once at the top of the document.
Pay product dash name, super widget or something.
Exactly. Or maybe under the main title. And then you just use product name where you need it in the text.
Ah, so if the name
You
changes.
change it in one place, the attribute definition, and it updates everywhere automatically.
Wow. Okay, that's way better than find and replace. That's proper variable handling.
Yeah, really handy for things that might change or need to be consistent.
And it sounds like it goes beyond just text replacement. The sources mention conditional content using if-def.
Yeah, that's another really neat feature. If-def stands for if defined.
So you can show or hide parts of the document based on what?
based on whether an attribute is defined or not.
Okay, give me an example.
Let's say you have docs for different tiers of a product, maybe free and pro. You could define an attribute like .tier.pro.
Right.
Then you could wrap the pro-only features in fdef.pro blocks.
And those blocks only show up if the pro attribute is set.
Exactly. And you can even set these attributes from the command line when you build the document.
So you can generate different versions of the docs from the same source file just by changing a flag.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
Super flexible for targeting different audiences or platforms, or like showing different steps for Windows versus Mac.
That is seriously powerful stuff. Much more programmatic than typical Markdown.
Yeah, it leans more towards a system for generating documents.
Okay, let's talk everyday needs. Links, code blocks. How does AsciiDoc handle those?
Links are pretty intuitive. You put the URL, then maybe some descriptive text in square brackets.
https.example.com then visit example sort of thing.
Yep. And for linking internally, like to another section in the same document.
How does that work?
Usually double angle brackets like section aid, linking to a heading or an anchor you've defined.
Okay, straightforward enough. And code. Syntax highlighting is crucial.
Absolutely. AsciiDoc handles code blocks well. You mark it as a source block, often specify the language.
Like source Python.
Exactly. And you can set attributes to tell it which syntax highlighter to use, like rouge or pigments.
Nice.
But here's the really cool part. You can include code directly from external files.
The whole file?
You can, but you can also include just specific lines or even sections you mark with special tags inside the code file itself.
Whoa. So your documentation code examples can literally be pulled from the actual source code.
Yes, which means your docs are much less likely to get out of sync with the code they're describing.
That solves a massive headache in technical documentation, keeping examples up to date.
It's a huge win. Yeah.
Okay, tables. Markdown tables can be fiddly and limited.
Basic tables are okay, but anything complex gets tricky.
What does AsciiDoc bring to the table?
Well, first, the syntax is maybe a bit more structured. You use pipe characters similar to some Markdown flavors.
Right.
But AsciiDoc adds proper support for headers, footers, and you can even import table data directly from a CSV file.
Import from CSV. That's handy.
Very. But the real power feature is cell spanning.
Ah, making one cell cover multiple rows or columns, like in HTML.
Exactly. Standard Markdown just doesn't do that. AsciiDoc has specific syntax using dots and numbers to define row spans and column spans.
Okay, that unlocks much more complex table layouts.
Definitely. And you can even use AsciiDoc formatting inside table cells if you mark the cell correctly.
Wow. Okay, so tables are significantly more capable.
Night and day, really, for complex data.
What about things like callouts, notes, warnings, tips?
AsciiDoc has those built right in. They're called admonition blocks.
Like note or warning.
Yep, and they typically render with distinct icons and styling. Note, important, warning, caution, tip, they're all standard.
Makes documents much easier to scan for important info.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's also a sidebar block type for related content that's kind of outside the main flow.
Good for tangential info or examples. What about lists? Unordered, ordered.
Pretty standard stuff there. Hyphens or asterisks for unordered lists.
Okay,
Numbers followed by a dot for ordered lists.
Yeah.
Some editors even auto-number them as you type.
nice. Any other list types?
Yeah, description lists too, where you have a term, then double colons, then the description. Good for glossaries.
We got it. And images.
Also straightforward, image.filename.png, you can add alt text and dimensions inside the brackets.
Image.cat.jpga cute cat with 300.
Something like that, yeah. Options for alignment too.
Okay, this sounds incredibly comprehensive. What about really advanced stuff? Math, diagrams.
Yep, covered. AsciiDoc has built-in support for math using AsciiMath syntax.
Okay, math.
Yeah, a simpler way to write math than, say, LaTeX. But you can use LaTeX too, usually via plugins, if you need its full power.
Okay, and diagrams. You don't just embed images.
You can,
Yeah.
but the really powerful way is integrating with tools like Plant UML.
Plant UML lets you write diagrams as text, right?
Exactly. So you can define UML diagrams, sequence diagrams, mind maps, whatever Plant UML supports, right there in your AsciiDoc text.
And it generates the diagram image automatically when you process the document.
That's the magic. Your diagrams live with your text version controlled together.
That is seriously cool. Source controlled diagrams.
Huge benefit.
Wow. Okay, anything else? Can you drop in raw HTML if you absolutely need to?
Yep, there's a pass-through mechanism for including raw HTML or other formats when necessary.
Good escape hatch. Bibliographies, like for academic papers or books.
Possible with plugins. There are things like AsciiDoc BibText that handle citations and bibliography generation.
And a table of contents index.
Often handled automatically by the processor, especially AsciiDoc. You can mark index terms easily too, usually with double parentheses.
So keyword would mark keyword for the index.
That's the common convention, yeah.
Man, it really feels like they thought of everything for publishing.
That seems to be the consensus from the sources. It was designed for technical documentation and publishing from the start.
Unlike Markdown, which was more for simple web content initially.
Right. Markdown's great for readings, comments, simple blogs. AsciiDoc traces its roots back to DocBook.
DocBook, that XML standard for books.
The very same. So AsciiDoc inherits that focus on structure, semantics, and producing complex outputs like books, PDFs, ebooks, man pages, all from one source.
And that single specification we mentioned earlier really pays off here.
Absolutely. You write it once, and you have much higher confidence it will generate correctly to HTML, PDF, EPB, whatever, using a tool like AsciiDoc.
And you mentioned major publishers use it.
Yeah, O'Reilly, for example, accepts manuscripts in AsciiDoc. That's a pretty strong endorsement.
Definitely speaks to its suitability for professional work.
And while the syntax might seem a bit more complex initially, the tools are getting better.
Like editors with smart features.
Yeah, auto-completion for syntax, live previews, that can lower the barrier to entry quite a bit.
Okay, so let's try to summarize this for you listening. Why might AsciiDoc be the right call?
Well, pulling it all together from the sources, you get a much richer feature set than basic Markdown. That's clear.
Right. Includes attributes, conditionals, advanced tables, diagrams.
The single standard means more predictable output, which is vital for professional docs.
Less, it works on my machine with rendering.
Exactly. And its entire design philosophy is geared towards documentation and publishing.
So while Markdown might win on sheer simplicity for quick notes,
AsciiDoc really shines when your needs get more complex, when you need that power and consistency.
and the learning curve might not be as steep as it sounds, especially if you're already technically inclined.
That seems to be the case. If you're comfortable with markup concepts, adding AsciiDoc's features might feel more like extending your knowledge than learning something totally new.
So the takeaway is, if you're heavily involved in technical writing, software docs, creating manuals, publishing to multiple formats,
Then AsciiDoc is definitely worth a serious look. It could solve a lot of problems you might be hacking around with in Markdown.
right. So we've journeyed through AsciiDoc from its basic syntax similarities and differences with Markdown.
All the way to its really powerful features like includes, conditions, diagrams, and its publishing focus.
We hope this gives you a clearer picture. Maybe think about your own workflows.
Yeah, are there frustrations you have with your current tools that AsciiDoc seems designed to address?
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Could adopting something like AsciiDoc, with its focus on standards and features, actually lead to better, more maintainable, more professional documentation in the long run?
Even if there's, a bit of upfront learning.
It's something to consider.
Yeah, maybe check out the AsciiDoc project online. Try writing a small document, see how it feels.
Experiment a little.
Couldn't hurt.
Okay, that wraps up our deep dive for today.